final session, and I promise it won't drag too long. We knew this day would extend beyond the times, which is why we left this session as open-ended as possible. This will end at 5, so you can get your trains and trams and all that sort of stuff home. Thanks, guys. So my name's Seb. I work here as the CXO. I'm responsible for this thing called experience. I'm also now responsible for collections. So that's a very exciting new addition to my cluster of teams, which are a little ramshackle and moving in exciting directions. So the four of us are going to have a bit of a provocation and a chat about a range of issues. But we thought we just might each say who we are.
Well, you've heard from me. My name's Asti. I'm the time-based art conservator at the Art Gallery of New South Wales. Just thought it might be worth noting that that position was only made permanent 3 weeks ago. Prior to that, I was like, oh, that's not why. No, it wasn't for applause, I promise. It was to sort of just lead in that prior to that, it was contract positions part-time in 6 months over a period of 3 years. So long time coming. So it wasn't just like, hey, come in and here's a position, yay. It was, a lot of advocating to get there.
I'm Adam Nash. I make playable art. I've done that for about 35 years now. And I'm also the Associate Dean of Digital Design in the School of Design at RMIT University.
And I'm Melanie Swalwell. I'm an Associate Professor in Screen and Media at Flinders University in Adelaide. And I wear a number of hats. I have interests, I like to say, at the intersections of digital games and media arts.
So, Adam, you had a provocation for us.
Yeah, thanks, Seb. I'm not sure how provocative it is, but I've really enjoyed the conversations that have transpired today. Some really great contributions. Something that I think we are witness to is a shift. This is not just in art, just generally a shift from technologies of representation to technologies of performance. We know, and we spoke about this earlier today, people like Groys and Sinway Shah talk of the digital as a performance medium, and it is easy for us to, it's easy to say that, technologies of performance versus technologies of representation. But the implications, I think, are very deep and very far-reaching, especially in terms of the kind of things that we're talking about today, especially what Melanie is going to talk about in terms of games culture, and the preservation of it. So some of the things that, in particular, that Kalani was talking about really are really, I think, excellent ways forward for thinking about what does it mean to be working with performance rather than representation. We know that, I think that it's a very simple thing to say that contained within, it's I guess a kind of a McLuhanistic move to say that contained within, let's call it the digital, is all prior media. And so it's a very simple move to include representation within performance, and certainly the role of cultural institutions that are explicitly conserving works need to stay attendant to representation. But I want to think more about what are the clues that we have had so far inherent in the idea of performance that enable us to think about how we might deal, both as cultural institutions but also as a culture, with works of the nature that we've been talking about today. And I think we can take a lot of clues from things that in the past have already been identified as performance. So I'm thinking about music, dance, things like this. These are not new problems for the worlds of music and dance. The kind of problems that we've been talking about today, how to preserve. ideas of versions, iterations, and things like this. Ideas of original versus copy, these kind of things. Authenticity, the score versus the performance, the work versus the apperception of the work. This is why I insist on my work being called playable media. I prefer this as a term to something like time-based media or something like that, because it, whilst it respects the notion of time, perhaps even more than a phrase like time-based media, but it's a phrase that allows a kind of a collaboration, I think. Playable. You can play this art. So it might mean you can play it like a piano. Maybe you play it like a game. Maybe you play it like you play an MP3 or a CD or something like that. So I just wanted to think about how the notion of performance can change the way that we approach the issues that we've been talking about today. Kalani, the work that Kalani is doing, I think, is really exemplary along these lines, and that's certainly the way that we should be going. But I think that as a culture, more generally, we need to take more seriously the invitation of the network, especially digital networks, because we see now a move. Whilst there was a little bit of a move towards a decentralized network in the last decade or so, we've seen serious moves towards centralization of network, curator, massive Californian libertarian digital capitalists kind of controlling the curation of all culture, really, across the network. And so we probably need to start thinking, taking seriously again the invitation of peer-to-peer networks. We've seen this emerge in what you might call maybe non-art world, things like blockchain and what have you. But the idea of a genuine collaboration, and I'm not sure that I think cultural institutions have a lot of work to do to understand where they might fit into that to enable a collaboration rather than be the arbiter of the future. And one more thing that I did want to say, that I think we heard this morning, I don't like this idea of future-proofing. I don't think the future is something that you have to guard against or protect your work from. And we heard this morning that the future is the past anyway. So that's what I wanted to say.
Melanie, do you want to talk a bit about your video game stuff, because that seems to play very well with what Adam's.
Okay. Well, I was going to sort of start by riffing on that question also that you posed of really, is future-proofing possible? And I have a bit of wariness around that question as well, because the tendency is to say, oh, it's all too hard, which I think has been the tendency for quite some time. And I've been working to hopefully advocate for the need to get on board and to start to take digital heritage materials seriously, and for cultural institutions which are charged with preserving our heritage to move into this space, but also recognising that, it is challenging, it is a steep learning curve. And so I've really worked to try and establish collaborative relationships, including particularly here with ACMI, where we worked on the Play It Again project, which was a game history and preservation project focused on 1980s games that were written for microcomputers locally in Australia and New Zealand. And Seb's just going to scroll through some of the slides from our Popular Memory Archive, which was created with a bunch of colleagues on the team, including Helen Stuckey. This was her idea, former games curator here at ACMI, for what she thought of as a demotic archive, demos, of the people. And we really sought to get contributions about the culture, if you like, of gaming and what it was like to play a game, to document the experience, to complement the collection of the object itself, which would which is held here at ACMI and has been preserved. So we've sought to collect, photographs of, people in their living rooms that show, that moment when the digital entered the home, if you like, and games are important within a wider history of digitality. I say games are artefacts on the road to our becoming digital. Oftentimes they were the way in which people first came into contact with a computer. And this is an incredibly important moment, and it's a moment when people are making games as well as playing them. And that's subject of some work that I'm finishing up at the moment. I'm writing a book on homebrew gaming. And homebrew, I'm happy to say, is included in the materials that have come here to ACMI. So we're looking not just at official production cultures, but unofficial as well, and everyday cultures. And, these are lovely photographs of very everyday consumption of photographs. Of games. So, I like to think, I suppose, about what do we understand the role of archiving and preservation to be, rather than is future-proofing possible. Helen makes the point very eloquently, I think, that, and it's hard to capture the experience of what it was like to play a game in the 1980s. Now, it doesn't translate. So you can have the most beautifully preserved object, but how do you convey the context, the excitement that sitting down with a blinking cursor and some text conveyed at the time? That doesn't, that has changed as we've changed. And so we sought to compile this popular memory archive to try to capture some of that context, I suppose. And it was explicitly an outreach to the public to say, tell us about your memories, tell us, open up your photograph albums, please, and share with us what you've got. Tell us your memories of, going around to someone's house and to try to get a conversation going. And if you flick through a bit also, said we had information, some beautiful shots in domestic interiors. It's hard to find photographs of people playing games in the 80s. I've curated other exhibitions of this material. Domestic shots are almost unheard of. And so in a way, that was the only way to do an outreach to get this kind of material. And there's now a bit more of them around.
These strike me as very similar to gallery shots of the installation shots of gallery works. Mm-hmm. That if we flip this around to these being media artworks, or say a Yayoi Kusama, an infinity room, it would be the selfies. These are the equivalent of the visitors taking selfies in the triennial, as a documentation of experience.
Yes.
That is perhaps more than the work, more valuable than the work in the longer term.
And in a way, now that we have, cameras in our pockets, it's perhaps easier to get those. Oftentimes people were so caught up in the experience of play that, the experience wasn't documented, I think. And also the fact that it was in private domestic space, but also the public shots. So yes, we also sought to, for instance, on a game like this, we had entries on 50 locally written games from Australia and New Zealand. And this very famous example from Beam Software, the first Australian game studio based here in Melbourne, The Way of the Exploding Fist. This is an example, of a comment where people are reflecting on their experience, their memories of playing the game and what it meant for them. So we're really trying to capture rich contextual data, I suppose, about this. And coming as a historical researcher of digitality, I think there's incredible value in this model of, having ephemera, anecdotes, interviews, oral history fragments, recollections, as well as contextual information from published sources, which is out there if you go digging. Like I've done the digging on projects that, people initially scratch their heads and go, why are you researching the history of games in 1980s New Zealand? And it can be hard to find, but it is out there. And so if I think about the future and, this future-proofing question, or what are we going to have to look back on from the now even, I think this kind of contextual material is incredibly valuable, and it should be part of any collecting strategy.
And perhaps if it's addressed as performance, we're very familiar with documenting performance and having experiential reactions to performance. I was thinking about Lorraine Vaughan and the work around the Circus Oz archive.
Yeah, that's right. I think with that archive, which they were calling the Living Archive, brought to light two. I think there's two major, I guess, elements in archiving or preserving performance works. The first is what we might think of as the standard documentation style. Documentation. So, for example, if it's a dance work or a circus work or some kind of live performance work, then a audio recording and whatnot. But then there's also the second element, and I just want to make it clear. I think this is a very legitimate way of documenting performance works, and in some ways you can capture the kind of ephemeral experiences that you're talking about as well, Melanie, and other people have mentioned today about what it is like for somebody to experience that work, depending on how it's done. But then the other way of doing it is, again, something that music and dance has always been very good at, which is what Troy, Innocent, and others today were referring to the system of the work and the preserving the system of the work. So whatever that work might be. Say in the case with music, music has done this for centuries. We've never had a problem with the idea of a score, for example, where there is not really until recorded music came along. There was not really any concept of an original piece of music. Every performance was the music is only in the performance, and the music as an object, I guess, existed as a score that divides time up into has a certain contract with the people who are looking at the score of, okay, there's a thing called time and it goes this way, and we're going to divide it up into about 15. Each minute's going to be about 15 bars long, and after the 64th of those, the violas will play an E flat or whatever it is, and there's no expectation that there will be an original or definitive version of that performance, and some of these works have lasted, like 1,000 years. I think the earliest known score is Hildegard of Bingen from 1248 or something like that can still be performed today, no problem. So from what performance gives us, I'm trying to say, are those two modes of attempts at preservation: a documentation, and then the living system itself, or what we might think of as the algorithms or the recipe or the instructions for performing the work. And I think that avoids any angst around whether it's an original performance or not.
There's a 2012 paper by Pip Lawrence in a seminal article that's available on the Tate's website, where she talks about time-based media artworks and installation and refers to them as scores.
Right, yeah.
That, so there's this idea that's sort of come out the Tate very early on that we should be treating these artworks exactly like a score. And just as a side note to the selfie, what I find now is I do iteration history reports for every artwork that comes into our collection and goes on display, because not only do I want to record the iterations that exist within the institution, but also the iterations that existed before it came to the institution. And one of my methods of recording that is hashtags on Instagram, because often as well as wanting to know if it's a successful iteration, if that's what the artist deemed was their work or a successful version of their work, I also want to know the spatial parameters and the changes that take place. So for me, before we even go to display a work, it's a really important process that I like to undertake, and it's made a lot easier by Venmo and Instagram.
Yeah, and it also suggests Troy's experience. We were talking about this at lunch as well, and also talking earlier with Katrina about it means that, so Troy's experience, and I had a similar one, the image for this session was a work of mine that a version of which I first performed here in 2004 and using VRML. the most beautiful and perfect scene graph language ever developed. Now, I have been able to reconstruct those works thanks to, it's not emulation, it's a replaying through JavaScript in the browser. I was very pleased to hear about your attitude towards it must be browser accessible, because these are one of the few, the browser is one of the few genuinely open kind of technologies that we've got. I'm so pleased to see a return to, for example, JavaScript and stuff happening in the browser now that browsers can talk to the low-level hardware. But what I want to say is that it means that the practitioners themselves, as musicians and dancers and other kind of performers always have done, we need to stay attendant while we're making the work to how are we kind of documenting how it's being put together. And it's easy to say, but Troy and I know that in practice, generally what you do is just bash some code out and then it runs and you're happy with that and you move on to the next thing. And you always think, I must go back and comment that or document it, but you never do. And so it was struck me today as something that might be worthwhile. At the moment, for the last year or so, I've been developing a personal AI, and I've fed it all of the code that I've ever written in the hope that it can make the work for me and I can just go and do what I like to do, which is birdwatch. And it works really well. Like it produces really beautifully formed code, but the code doesn't work at all because it's complete nonsense. But when you look at it, it really looks like proper code, you know. But now I'm thinking, that's stupid anyway. Maybe a good idea actually is to train an AI to watch you as you work, as you're actually making the thing, so that the AI comes to learn your kind of methods and can predict what you're going to do and take care of that kind of documentation. You know, some software systems do have self-documenting code systems now, so that might be worth something that might be something that's worth thinking about more seriously from now on.
So maybe we should talk about manifesto.
Okay.
What do you reckon?
Can.
I want to pull up your
My
slide for this.
Okay, so is it okay if we just jump back one
Sure.
to sort of provide the context? So this little 3 slides is a series that I presented to the trustees of my gallery after I came back from the MoMA workshop, and I think that's actually worth sharing, was because as well as conducting all the conservation duties around time-based media art, I spent a lot of time convincing people that it's important and significant. And so you sort of find strategies to do so. And one really effective one was this group of trustees, you know, who have been part of the gallery for, 10, 20 years, and sort of just comparing 2 exhibitions that were on at the time, one being Manifesto and the other one being this watercolours show, and sort of just very clearly laying out the same object that's in storage, then goes into treatment, then goes on to display. And it's a very linear process, a very static one. And then whereas for Manifesto, what we got was this. And just this idea, because down the hall we had a 13-channel installation that has, I think it was 36 channels of sound, over 1,000 meters of Ethernet, and just, a whole other world, unto itself. And so the other sort of important thing to talk about with Manifesto, I thought, was the iterative nature of it. So if we jump to the next one, I think, did I do ACMI and us? No, I picked New York.
Of course you did.
A nicer ceiling. Is the fact that what you get, that idea of that out of the box, that this USB actually contains these massive installations that have very strict parameters. But moreover, so this work was commissioned by ACMI, the Art Gallery of New South Wales, and the Hamburger Bahnhof, I believe. And so that's 3 institutions working with this one artist, Julian Roosevelt, over a period of 2 years to realise this work. And then each of us installed it at different times. I believe ACMI, you guys had the first
we
one
did the
in
premiere.
Australia. Yeah.
We did the premiere in our Gallery 1, which is a narrow space with very high ceilings. And I think the subsequent versions took lessons from how the sound worked in there, and the artist began to realise, listening to Kalani's talk about prototyping the works in gallery spaces, I thought was really fascinating.
Yeah.
And this was an example of that. With each iteration, it gets better.
It changed and it evolved and the sound morphed. But also, sort of more importantly, this was the best lesson for our gallery in the true cost of an artwork that you pay for an artwork. And in actual fact, the cost to create the work is triple, the cost of said artwork. And, so we've got a bunch of policies and procedures in place now that really aim to try to capture the true cost. We've created a contemporary art group. We utilise forms that are readily available on the Matters of Media Art group. So basically, before we acquire an artwork, everybody from curator, registrar, head of install, AV, conservators are sitting in a room together and figuring it out. How much is it going to actually cost and take, and how much time to create or perform or function or get this work to function. And that, for our institution, has been a huge step forward in really, truly understanding what the object is that we've acquired and how it needs to exist in a space.
Do you think the object changes as the institution finds new uses for it? Let me give so when I was working at the CooperHewitt in New York, this is a work actually that Ben is now looking at as it's left a bit of a explosive presence within the archive, I guess. The CooperHewitt, we acquired one of the first apps to go into the Smithsonian's collection, and that was acquired as source code that was publicly released to the network as a provocation to this notion of non-institutional specialists who could help in the preservation of that work in the long term, but also that we preserved it as a GitHub repo. So it was a GitHub repository with the changes, the code intact and open sourced. It's an object with versions when it arrives at the museum, but the purpose of that wasn't to preserve the work. It was really, it sits on a shelf as well, which I think was a bit ridiculous, but was a legacy of the cataloguing system that required that. But what did you actually acquire? What we actually acquired was this notion that we acquired the intent of the makers and the processes through which they achieved that intent, the design principles and models that were possible at that moment in time. And it wasn't so much about the final work, but in order to do this sort of work in 2010 with the affordances of iOS, at that time, this is what you did. And I think that it's quite, Roosevelt's work or many other media artworks are working with the tools they have available to them then. And I think, as Troy and Adam and others have said, if they could rebuild that now, they would do it in a different way. And so, I would hope that, I think there's been some chatter on Twitter about the institutions trying to stop time and preserve things as they are now or were. We haven't yet moved to acquiring the intent and purpose.
Yeah. For me, that's not necessarily about actively trying to make a living object a static one. To me, it's an understanding. It's about, again, we've talked about it so many times, about language and about a notion of what you are receiving and understanding that. Like, we've really got a handle on it with our new acquisitions, but let's say we've got a backlog of 150 artworks where these conversations weren't had. And these works, go back to the 1950s, the 1960s. So they're conversations you're having 50 years after the fact, even, 10 years, 5 years after the fact. We were talking about it in the break a little bit, sort of this idea of loss, and that an institution also has an obligation for sort of social history, and that, Tatsuya Miyajima, his LED works are a great example. He's so open to change. As he says, it's concert to my concept, that of course you would change the LEDs, of course you would change the transformers. But once it's moved into an institution where there's financial ramifications, there's, different levels of legality, and also curatorial perspective of, if we change all of Miyajima's works from 1995 to the latest LEDs and we keep doing so every 5 years, then we only have documentation of the work, the 1994 version of the work. And I don't know if it's kitschy or this obsession with old technology, but I think you have to be careful before you sort of just jump ahead and be like, well, let's just change everything because we can, because the artist said it was cool.
Is it but is that an aversion to artist performance? That we don't have that issue with lots and lots of music. We don't have that with theatre or dance. We reinterpret, we remix, we build upon.
Yeah, because I definitely think so, yeah. Because I think that, well, you know, there's an I in ACMI, and the I stands for image, right?
I think so. It's the first kind of thing people ask. What do the letters stand for?
Pretty sure it stands for image. So it is that is a reflection of the fact that it is coming from, I think, the gallery context of visual art, of paintings and sculptures, and that is why it is a problem, because you know, you're yet to have that long opportunity to understand how these works play out over time, and a painting or a sculpture is, depending on your point of view, but for a human, is a static work, but it's quite unusual in that. So yeah, I definitely think it's something that the idea of the technology of performance brings that up. It needs to be redefined. I think that's what you're trying to do in your
Well, I'm interested in. It started off as a conference paper and it's been published now as a chapter called "Moving On from the Original Experience," and I am thinking about game culture and emulation, and the debates about, you know, how emulation changes a work. And I started off with the interesting, you know, like curious attachment that you see from some retro game collectors, aficionados, I would call them. You know, they're preservationists. It was a discussion that's happened on the game preservation list, and how they insist, you know, it has to be the original or else, you know. And these are the people who at the very same time understand the issues that, you know, it's not going to continue being that experience because the hardware's going to wear out, the CRT screens are not going to continue to be available, etc., etc. And so there's a tension there between a longing for, you know, what was, and you know, and nostalgia's complex. But I'm also interested in one of the projects that I have prepared, you know, in conjunction with ACMI and the Art Gallery of New South Wales, which is under consideration at the moment, is a media arts preservation project. And I'm very interested in the approach that that Cornell University Library took in its imaging and emulation project with the Rose Goldson Archive. I think, Ben, you were involved with that project, where they asked artists if they invited them to author a statement on how emulation might change their work. And I think that's such an elegant way to deal with the problem, you know, rather than trying to deny it exists or, you know, roll back time, which we know we can't do. You know, you're acknowledging there are degrees of fidelity and you're inviting a statement on that to be made. So that's something that we intend to incorporate into the project.
Should we throw to questions? I'm just conscious of time.
I wanted to say something about non-art context, if I can, because I think the elephant in the room is surely, I mean, there was I think a provocation itself written in the blurb for this panel about, you know, should we just print it out on paper? Or maybe that was the image that you gave.
Yeah.
Surely analog media is the answer. It's like, ooh.
Well, microfilm lasts apparently for 500 years.
Yeah,
right?
I reckon. I really think that paper is that's a legitimate option here for the preservation of some of these works, because paper, if you can describe, say for example, Troy's work that you were looking at before, Troy, if you could write out all of that code, descriptions of the plans and whatnot for all of the stands and how to build the touch sensors and what have you, and also even to the extent of writing out the pixel maps if you're using textures and things like that, and print them out on good quality paper, then we know that paper lasts at least 500 years if it's kept properly. That's a lot long. We've got no idea how long any of this other media is going to last. So I think it's a legitimate option, paper. And I think we're going to see a move definitely over the next few years towards people in power, I should say, rich people and people in power, making sure that none of their, whatever it is that they're doing, is captured digitally in any way because of not wanting to be hacked or something like that.
All right, well, I see your provocation and I raise you. Can we go to the Clifford Lynch stewardship slide? Because I've been following quite closely the
This one?
previous one,
That one.
the
Yeah, there we go.
analysis that's been coming out of the Cambridge Analytica hack, the unravelling, emerging story of what went on in the 2016 election, the antics on Facebook. The image on the right is from Jonathan Albright's work from Harvard University, where he is explaining in a medium.com piece, the targeting that went on, the micro-targeting of groups around the Black Lives Matter movement. And this is a really interesting essay that Lynch has written about stewardship in the age of algorithms that's come out, and it becomes increasingly clear, your experience on Facebook is not my experience on Facebook, and what we all saw was different, and how the hell do you even begin to start to capture something like that for future historians? And I just wanted to briefly refer to this work that has just recently gone up, I believe, which I kept waiting for the images to load of the ads, but I don't think they're there. But it takes the data from Facebook and is showing the interests and the likes that were, through the Facebook's custom audiences tool, were targeted with different messages. And I'm afraid that's just not going to work on paper.
Yeah,
so this is an interesting,
that's absolutely right.
interesting moment, I think, of an interesting way to represent what went on in terms of the data, in terms of the spend, in terms of the views, in terms of the micro-targeted groups. And this is not the near future, this is our future.
Yeah.
This is our current moment, sorry.
Yeah.
It's...
We have a very poor concept of the network still, I think. We're not quite there yet. And I think the sort of notion of archives as well, when we're talking about networked archives, we always go to the most conservative form of those rather than a truly decentered one, which is...
And that's what I meant before about we need to start looking as practitioners and just as people, really, of taking sort of more responsibility and more power in our role as actors in a network, to get Lutorian about it, to think about decentralized networks in it. We've never had a genuinely decentralized network in the world, and we've had this experience recently of this massive centralizing and concentration of power in the hands of very few, even though it was using the global network. And I definitely think you're right. It's time now for us to take seriously mesh networks, peer-to-peer networks, and things like that, because that might be theoretically, it should be as durable as paper, right? A mesh network.
And if we think back to the first session with the Mulca project, a lot of the work they've been doing is really peer-to-peer.
Yeah, exactly.
Archiving.
Exactly, yeah.
Except we haven't all observed that previously.
Yeah.
And and the institutional types that we are, you and I particularly, are a bit allergic to. We are allergic to them.
Yeah, well, it's sort of trying to, instead of sort of teaching someone about the intangible and getting someone to be comfortable in that environment, it's like the default just back to the tangible. And I guess I just kept thinking of this like silly little story when I first started at the art gallery. I was just doing a survey on all the works in the collection and just going through the boxes. And what I noticed was a common trend was that all of the Mac Minis, the hard drives, the SD cards, they were stored in beautiful archival housing and, temperature controlled conditions, but nobody had checked the data. So when I came along and started to check things, I had this one particular artwork and it was a happy ending, so I can tell the story. So this Mac Mini, I got it out of this beautiful box, loaded it up, and it turned out the artist had given us his personal Mac Mini instead of the artwork, and we actually had his kitchen redesign and a dodgy copy of Tron Legacy. And
Maybe that was the artwork.
Or maybe. It wasn't. And so it was fine. We got in touch with the artist. He was like, this is from 2009 and I did this in 2015. So it was like, oh, I wondered where that went. So it's fine. We have the artwork now. But for me, that's just the most beautiful, simple example of treating something intangible like a tangible physical object.
So no wonder my kitchen looks like this.
It was like it looked like a lovely kitchen.
Yeah.
Hi. Thank you. That's been a really fascinating session. I wanted to kind of pick up on a couple of things across what you were talking about, the provocation around paper, and also the slides that compared the manifesto exhibition and the discussion around how that developed and evolved across the different institutions who'd commissioned and displayed it, and connect that to actually the shot of the paintings going through the process of coming out of storage through conservation into the gallery display. And I guess the thing about paper is, as you said, if stored properly, paper can last 500 years, but really storing paper properly requires it being in a temperature-controlled dark space where no human actually gets to see or touch or experience it. So we can put paper into storage, but actually in a display context, in a museological context where you're bringing paper to the public, it's one of the most fragile objects in the whole collection. And to link that back to the oil painting, I'm speaking tomorrow and I'll talk a lot about this notion of performativity through the lens of media. And in one sense, we can think about a painting also performs itself as it goes through a constant process of decay and restoration, and all of the painful questions that conservators have over the years about, should we, put the red back in the Renaissance painting or shall we let it decay, and all of those kinds of questions around what is the authentic Rembrandt are kind of parallel. So the thing about the digital, in the way you were talking about manifesto and how it developed and evolved, and how every time it displays we accumulate more knowledge about the work, more documentation, whether you're obtaining that through Instagram or through the kind of networks with other institutions. In some sense, the digital has every opportunity to exceed oil paint and paper as a preservable medium if we actually do understand how it performs itself, and if and that we don't separate that from the knowledge already existing in the institution around painting and paper and all of those things.
Yeah, I'm not trying to go to war with traditional media at all. I think the difference here is, and that's accepted and understood and supported. We all have multi-million-dollar physical storage systems, but yet we're having difficulty getting enough traction to start a pilot project for our digital storage. That we understand that a work on paper has to go into a 50 lux environment, and we respect that, but yet we don't have experts who can stand with a work as it's being installed for 4 days and do an iteration report because that's deemed not yet necessary. So I think really it's just about time, and I just keep coming back and sort of just being change makers, I guess.
Is it also a bit that in institutions there's a sense that we've run out of storage already, and these are just new works, and they're harder?
Well, also they require the exact opposite to keep a work on paper alive. Like you said, it goes into a box and it's in dark conditions, and when you open that box in 100 years, it's still there. However, if you do the same to your digital work in 5 years' time, it's gone. Actually, in order to keep that artwork alive, you need a system and processes in place to automatically open this so it doesn't succumb to bit rot and corruption. And again, that's about education, about understanding that these artworks, they're not the same, and we can't treat them the same in our institutions, that we need specialist skills, technologies and infrastructures to properly preserve these works.
And with the paper, I'm not suggesting that the paper is the paper as the original work. I'm talking about like literally like printing out the code, which I'm actually, after this discussion today, I'm going to start doing that. I'm just going to print out all my code, keep it in a box, and because you can read it. And, 15, 20 years from now, when there's a totally different platform, instead of having to try and reconstruct what it was, there's the instructions.
And
You're right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Exactly, yeah.
And I can say we've written into our purchase agreement that now when we purchase the computer-based artworks, we want the source code. However, we've had terrible trouble trying to get that from artists because artists have had this sense of, but all my mistakes are in here. This is the blueprint. So there's this sort of negotiation then that like, well, we need this thing to keep your work alive.
Yeah, good point.
But not wanting to hand over the blueprint.
Yeah.
It's interesting because when the same institutions commission third parties to build their websites or designs or do work for hire, the source code is delivered full of mistakes, and it's an accepted part of business practice. The contracts are there for work for hire already. They do.
Totally. Well, you wouldn't say the same about artist drawings. That we definitely have all of Sydney Nolan's sketches and sketchbooks and drawings and coffee spills on his drawings.
This is a bit of a tangent, but it touches on something in the last question. We're quite used to, the energy costs of looking after traditional media, and there's been a lot of discussion, particularly in the last couple of decades, about temperature set points, widening them so we save energy costs. I'd just be really interested to know if any of you are starting to factor that into future plans for preserving digital media, because, we're seeing it more with things like Bitcoin and stuff like that. Like, they're talking about how much energy it takes to preserve it. So I just wondered if you had any thoughts on that.
That might be a better one for Ben. I can say that I'm still up to the part of digital storage costs money.
Yeah.
I'm still working on that part.
Mesh networks are key there, I reckon.
Yeah.
Because it's, in a mesh network, it's by no means, it doesn't have any cost, but the cost is already being borne by the node.
I perhaps could speak about that from the perspective of pretty well being limited to project-based funding. That's what we apply for as researchers. If you're lucky enough to get it, it's 3 years, which is why it's important to partner with a cultural institution that, is going to be around. But it's something that we haven't gotten to the bottom of yet in terms of how do we, for instance, factor in storage, the costs of storage, of long-term storage. It's on our radar. Advocating for, better understanding and consciousness around the needs of born digital preservation, I think that comes under that heading, and that's something that I am very committed to, but I don't have the answers. Keep raising the knowledge.
Yeah, I think it's actually, if we think about the power eventually going out too, that it is through community preservation that's probably the only way for institutions that actually multiple copies distributed and communicated and performed is the only way. My colleague Aaron Cope, who was with me at CooperHewitt when we were acquiring Planetary, we would always talk about the time the power goes off, and not goes off temporarily, but actually climate brings it to a point where the institutions are not institutions.
I've just started a desktop LTO backup process, and it's terribly depressing. Writing everything to LTO and then knowing it's going to take me 8 hours to get it back.
Hi, yeah, so that was actually part of the question I was going to ask. But just on top of that, in conservation, we've been talking a lot about sustainability over the last many years. And one thing about digital content is that it generates a lot of e-waste and also energy consumption. And so I was wondering if there's any kind of thinking forward about how we move beyond, as we're talking in this panel, the material of like tangible storage of data and into more, well, I mean, even cloud-based data is stored somewhere on a server that is physical. And so it's kind of a inherent vice of digital media, as well as all media that we conserve in arts, that it is material-based and all resources are finite.
Well,
there might not be an answer to
I
that
get
question.
the shivers when I see those, recycling drives where they're encouraging people to empty their attics and whatnot, because it's good that on the one hand, the cadmium and whatnot isn't going into landfill, but also I want those machines to be in good hands. And I think, we are all indebted to the work that collectors have done over the decades before any of this was really on our radars. Often game collectors who just did it because they loved playing the games of their youth. We keep a functional hardware lab going at Flinders University. Denise DeVries has set up a computer archaeology lab, and we are very fond of original hardware as part of the answer here. So,
but those private collections don't go away when they're institutionalized. I think some of the work, particularly around video game preservation, is that the video games remain circulating in the enthusiast community, and they're copied by institutions, and so that's sort of lots of copies keeps it safe sort of model, and the scarcity model of art of contemporary art's allergic to that type of preservation.
And really that intersection is just even more becoming even more fascinating to me. There's so many different angles to look at it from. The way that something that is making me chuckle at the moment is the way that the lingering elitism of the art world is kind of having to give way, if grudgingly, to the fact that enthusiasts, whatever we call them, have professionals, as Nick put it, have developed emulators that are going to be the way in which these artworks are able to be displayed once the hardware gives out or the operating systems are obsolete. There's so many interesting intersections there. It's a very productive area to be.
And certainly in the arcade retro game space, it's been fascinating to see the emergence of the Chinese emulators and the mass manufacturing in Shenzhen and other places of, the emulator kits you buy on eBay with small electronics running all these arcade games that have come from the RIPs that have gone up to, that have become part of the MAME project and other things. So I think that there are other networks that are emerging as well, that are interesting, that perhaps us in the English speaking world are not fully aware of or happen in parallel. I was talking at lunch with Ben and Nick about the cell phone repair specialists, who are specialist communities of knowledge that we as art institutions or cultural organisations don't often engage with, who carry specialist skills forward, that are outside the traditional enthusiast communities we know about and engage with regularly.
There's a larger point about digital storage I'll get onto in a moment, but just quickly the paper stuff. I think there's
Starting to wish I hadn't.
No.
said that.
It just reminded me of the whole history of the Library of Congress's paper print collection of films and the way that's gone through iterations as it's moved on and off film over its time. The original stuff was still paper, but the difficulty of getting it off the paper into digital copies or film copies, going back to it's a history worth looking into.
Yeah, interesting.
You know that the only way a lot of really early silent films survived was on paper.
Right, interesting.
Yeah.
And there's no doubt that it would be a huge amount of work. Transcribing, I mean, printing it out is a huge amount of work in itself and very energy intensive. But then getting it back from paper into the digital again is a huge amount of work.
100-year history of the whole thing. I think there's some good news about digital storage, and I have a little bit to do with kind of audiovisual material as data in digital storage. I'm no specialist, but I kind of observe it day to day. And I think there's been a lot of debate at the moment amongst the audiovisual guys who are dealing with data management around the terror about the LTO pathway and the fact that the current iterations isn't necessarily going to be backward compatible. And I'm sure some people here kind of know this concern. But as some cooler heads are talking about, the great thing about LTO and the great thing about major data storage is that we're being helped here by big corporate business, is that it's not a special, once you can get the material on to data storage, going for all the emulation problems, banks are dealing with this stuff all the time, big corporations are dealing with it all the time. It's the same technology with LTO tapes and digital data storage. So if we can maybe look to partnerships with industry, I mean, I've dealt with guys who've done big projects with banks or big projects with television stations, and you talk about your digital storage problems for audio-visually, just go, not a problem, we've done projects that are 50 times the size. You don't necessarily have the money that they've got, but it's not a specialist, once you get in that realm, it's not a specialist conservation problem, it's basically a standard big corporate 21st century data preservation issue. So I think if we just keep thinking about the big picture about that, that's not so scary. It's getting it for our emulation processes into that format onto LTO tape in the first place. And it's also even being able to predict the cost of it, the energy costs and the storage costs. They're all fairly predictable factors, and the major institutional audiovisual archives are already dealing with this around the world at scale.
Okay, maybe we'll take one more and then,
I guess I just wanted to make comment that idea of, the nostalgia, maybe Melanie, the groups that kind of wanted to go into that sort of, originality forms. I mean, I guess that's what I look at institutions as being. There's that whole layer of connoisseurship, whatever, and that has always been a political thing of who has money and who gets to arbitrate those things. But at the same token, I guess even in the musical sphere, there's that idea of the historical instruments. There are layers of value that get met by that sort of original form. I think some of that this discussion we're having, though, is when we treat all our collection material at that level where I think Jan's comment about, 95% of the collection is good enough, can be a good enough preservation level, and that 5% is where we're investing this other layer that does need this mental investment, financial investment. So I guess I just wanted to sort of clarify, I think that's where conservators are understanding context is becoming so much more critical in what they're advocating for, and where they're happy to start saying, no, community does need to be part of this decision. But I think there is still a position for that point to say, actually, no, we do need to maintain the original. And that's a discussion of value, I guess, locked in with the present amongst curators and a bunch of people. So probably that ended up being more a statement than a question. But I guess connoisseurship, where does connoisseurship sit in all of this these days, really? The Wukun was talking about that deeper layer under the surface that very few people will actually invest energy, time and passion into.
Well, that makes me think about like a comment that I threw up on a slide from a net art preservationist, Anne Laforêt, the French net art preservationist, who talks about the archaeological museum as opposed to the art museum. And in a way, it goes on to that point about originality that I made earlier, getting over the kind of attachment to it always being the same. And she says that, visitors to... she's talking about, you can't help with net art. you can't keep the context the same. You know, many works actually refer to websites that are gone now, and so you know it's one of those ones where you cannot arrest time. And so she says that the archaeological museum is actually a better model than the art museum, because visitors to an archaeological museum don't expect to see how things were, you know, when they were new. They you know, present instead a plausible state of what the original situation might have been, you know.
That's really interesting, and it also requires the visitor to participate in that reconstruction, doesn't it?
It does, and it's kind of an imaginative reconstruction. And this goes to our conceptions of history. You know, history is not about how it really was, though for many people it is. So there are these tensions between, you know, what we're aiming for here. And I think this is quite a nice concept, because these are broken. And so she's looking forward to a time where people are going to possibly be viewing broken works of art in the museum. And yeah, it's
interesting.
Well, I think that's a really good point to stop on. I think that loops the whole day. So thanks everyone for coming along, and thanks a lot to all our speakers. The next big thing we have here is a new work by Zandy Begg, which launches on Tuesday night, and we encourage you all to come and see that in our gallery too, which is a free show, and stay kind of tuned for more information on our renewal. We will be closing in March and reopening subsequently with a redesigned space, and we'd love you to be involved in that process. There will be more information about what's actually going on revealed over the period of time. This was part of that, and this Media Preservation Lab is part of that development as a node in a network around Australia, if not the world. So thanks a lot.